Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in to today's show. We have a good slate of segments ahead for you today. We start off doing a deep dive into ESPN's Fantasy Top 25, looking at some of the big names on that list. Then I will offer you up some draft strategies and tips for your upcoming fantasy football drafts. Then I will evaluate one of the more controversial, if you will, QB rooms in terms of fantasy purposes. And then, of course, I close out today's show with two fascinating IDP player profiles about two up-and-coming secondary players. But before we get into any of those exciting segments, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show. It's a huge support to everyone involved at the network. We also receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving them at the link. gsmc.cloud is another way to support both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network at large. You can also leave any questions, comments, or concerns about the show and prior segments, or even today's show, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into a very exciting episode. Let's start off in the realm of top 25s. That is, ESPN releasing their fantasy football players' top 25 of the 21st century. Fantasy football, its nascent stages kind of started in the early 2000s. I know that there were a ton of different ways that you could play growing up in, say, the 90s, even the 80s, but it was all generated, the kind of hype surrounding it generated in the early 2000s. And to start the 21st century, there were some fantastic fantasy football players, and we're going to be looking at some of these on those lists that really stand out to me, really defined what fantasy football is all about, and maybe led to this kind of prelude to what we're seeing in fantasy football right now, because as you can see from what I'm going to talk about on this list, there are a lot of different positions. There are a lot of diverse guys at different positions who deserve to be on this list. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. And I'm really shocked at the number one overall fantasy football player that they named at the top of their list, because it's not the guy that everyone's been thinking about. In fact, it's a running back who never made a Super Bowl, who was on a team that never really challenged for the playoffs even, but he's still one of the greatest running backs of the early 2000s and of all time. And that is LaDainian Tomlinson. He had fantastic numbers for the running back position, but no other season was so fascinating for LaDainian Tomlinson than 2006, when he had 481.1 PPR points and 31 total touchdowns. He had 443.84 in 2005. Two of the best single-season PPR totals. He was a PPR monster starting off his career with LA. Fantastic throughout. Fantastic rusher. Fantastic receiver. Position high. 3,451.32 PPR fantasy points in the decade. I don't think that's a record that's going to be topped. Maybe Christian McCaffrey could touch it in the next couple of years, but LaDainian Tomlinson truly stands the test of time. And looking at the running back market now has really kind of bolstered what the running back market could become. He's redefined it. He's retooled it. He's really set the bar for what is expected, really, out of running backs at the running back position in fantasy terms. And then, of course, if you want to talk about positional fits, being a receiving running back really does help you a lot. And so, kudos to LaDainian Tomlinson for beating out this number 2 guy who everyone thought would have been at the top in Tom Brady, fantasy career leader. 5,944.36 fantasy points, 755.4 points ahead of other quarterbacks, more than any non-quarterbacks, 1,500. Second best fantasy season of all time. Came at the age of 44. That is his best fantasy football season of all time. Speaks to his longevity in this league. Speaks to the greatness that Tom Brady, whether you like him or not, brought to the game of football at the quarterback position. And at 44 years old, 374.74 fantasy points. And what I really think defines Tom Brady is not just his greatness, but the way he did it. The way he steadily and consistently improved year after year, where most quarterbacks would have probably retired around the 35 to 40 mark. He played well into his 40s and still believes he actually has something left in the tank. He wouldn't mind playing again, and he would gladly take up any offers that come his way should a team want to take a flyer on him. But for now, let's just appreciate the fact that Tom Brady, in real life and in fantasy, made the game of football great. And now let's switch to the wide receiver position, where the market's really in flux right now. But if you look at the early 2000s, you really had some really great options. And at number 6, Randy Moss might have been the best of all. While two of his best seasons in the league don't count because obviously they came in the late 90s, 98 and 99. 07, 23 receiving touchdowns for him, 385.3 fantasy points, second most ever at the position. No matter whether he played for Minnesota, New England, man was always catching passes. Really incredible when it comes to his catch radius. And even though they don't necessarily list any of the PPR stats for him, they're probably very high. And when I look at the receivers of this age, there definitely are some that really pop off the page and really jump out at you when you're picking in terms of fantasy. But no one really has the aura and presence of a Randy Moss. No one really grabs my attention like a Randy Moss right now. Yes, Justin Jefferson has a very similar catch radius. Yes, there are some stars waiting in the wings. There's no one who really could grab a position by the scruff of the neck and make it their own. And that's what Randy Moss did in the early parts of the century. And then, to round it all off, let's go to the tight end position. Because that position right now is perhaps the most scrutinized in fantasy. Nobody thought the tight end position would be where it is right now, where we have two disparate generations. The elder guard and Travis Kelce, George Kittle, and Mark Andrews. The younger guard, Sam Laporta, Trent McBride. We never thought we would be here talking about these guys. And the guy in number 9 on ESPN's list might have just led the revolution. Might have just started the revolution at the tight end position in terms of fantasy. When I think about tight ends of the past 2 decades, this guy should top the list. Never really made deep playoff runs. Never really got the attention he deserved until now. And now, I can safely say that if it weren't for this guy, I don't really think the tight end position in fantasy would be where it is. And thank God for him, is Tony Gonzalez. Tony Gonzalez, when you think about tight ends in the modern era especially, he's really someone who ticks all the boxes for the tight end position. If you go back in history, yes, you have like Kellen Winslow at the tight end position, maybe a Mike Ditka or something like that. But in fantasy purposes, in fantasy terms, you can't get better than Tony Gonzalez. He had 70 catches in 13 of the 14 years he played. That's impressive for a tight end position. He averaged over 200 plus points at the tight end position, where it's very rare we ever see tight ends really get over 200 points 10 times this century. He truly is a figurehead for the tight end movement. And I look at what's happening today. Guys like Travis Kelce and George Kittle and Mark Andrews being the pinnacles of longevity at the tight end position, being the pinnacles of what people want in a fantasy tight end. It's all because of Tony Gonzalez. And I really hope these younger tight ends take Tony Gonzalez's practices to heart and really model their game after his. because I really think the tight end position not only is growing more important in how you view the certain players within that spectrum, but also how they develop consistently as players. We want this younger generation to be at the levels where Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and George Kittle are right now. And so they have to find a way to continue to progress in order for that narrative to play along. But ultimately, when I look at the players I've named on this list, I tried to name one from every position to show you how far fantasy football has come and how far we have come in terms of our views in terms of selecting our fantasy football teams. And so I really hope that this segment gives you a nice little perspective on how you should build your fantasy team going forward. Because there aren't going to be guys like this anymore. That's the fact of the matter. The 21st century was perhaps the height, and I'm sad to say it, the height of fantasy football. And yes, you have fantastic players now, but are they really generation defining as a LaDainian Tomlinson, as a Tom Brady, as a Randy Moss, as a Tony Gonzalez? You're going to have to rethink about that question as these next couple of years go on. Because these guys are excellent, but me sitting here saying these names cements them into a history of players you'll rarely find in fantasy. And it's ultimately up to us how to define fantasy going forward. Because it's not just the player, it's the lore they create. It's the narrative they set at the position that makes them stand the test of time. And that's the ultimate goal for what our generation of fantasy football players and managers should aim for. Because in 25 years or so, when they come up with another top 25 list, there are going to be some names that are controversial. None of these names are controversial here today. But that will just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming up next, we transfer and kind of stay in the fantasy football realm to draft strategies. How to select your fantasy football team. Kind of a interesting duality between fantasy football of the past and fantasy football of the present. We'll be right back after the break with that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you guys yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to all involved at the network. Also leave any questions, comments, or concerns about the show, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into our next segment of today's show and talk about some of the fantasy football draft strategies that are defining this upcoming fantasy football draft. Now, in terms of draft strategies, and tomorrow I'll go over this a little bit more in depth, as for the second time ever, I'm going to be presenting you guys my own fantasy football mock draft that I did. I believe it's integral to really pick a lane to choose from in how you draft your fantasy football team, because there are going to be a lot of different people telling you a lot of different things about how and which routes to take. And so these ideas really are steeped in not just tradition, but how you view importance in position and how you take that with you into your draft. And so, looking at all the notes I took down, I think there are many interesting yet controversial options that are either warnings or things you can really carry over into how you view this. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, the first strategy involves, well, with the new heightened sense of the running back market, the heightened aura surrounding it all. How to define the first two picks. Because in terms of the running back market, you really have a lot of high-end talent that drops off immediately as you get into later rounds. Even like round 3. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the mock round. When you really have that 1-2 pick at the beginning, you're really kind of lost in space after that. Because you have a solid a solid running back. Either McCaffrey, Hall, whatever guy you want to pick at the top of your rankings. And then when you go down through later rounds, you're realizing that, oh no, I don't have a good secondary option. So there are two ways to think about this. One is a popular strategy of hero running back, where you go out swinging and try and get two guys at the top end of the draft, the first or second rounds, that really define the running back market. Or you take the zero running back strategy and wait a little bit so that your team doesn't necessarily have a high-end running back, but it has two quote-unquote solid, decent options. And the way I think about those two kind of drastic decisions is that either way, you are kind of getting balance. And you know that my personal value in a fantasy football team is balance. If it's hero running back, you get a Christian McCaffrey and a someone else. Christian McCaffrey, I don't believe, is always going to have as many good games as people think. I think that the 49ers are a team that distributes the wealth. So try and swing for a guy. Like I said, there are guys like Spears and White that you might want to take flyers on. And there are some other guys, such as Kenneth Walker, who's gone under the radar a lot, but still is performing like a top 10 running back in fantasy. So, with hero running back, you have more opportunities to diversify your running back room, and most importantly, still value someone like a McCaffrey or Hall. Whereas with the zero running back strategy, by waiting, it also allows you to have more balance, because there is still a second tier left in running backs. I still think that, say, Kenneth Walker to, I don't know, Ramondre Stevenson or something like that, there's a second tier there to be had. And they're guys that aren't going to get you 20 to 25 points or anything ridiculous like that, like you expect out of the higher end of this class. But they are still, at the end of the day, very solid options. The bottom line with selecting running backs is that no matter what, the strategy you employ will not necessarily define your team. Because if you're the hero, you have one of the top 2 picks, top 3 picks, what have you, and you swing for the fences, you know you're going to have a guy who, like, you're not dropping and will start for many weeks. But you also have a guy who, let's say McCaffrey gets injured. He has a good injury history. He is going to immediately step in and just give you a solid balance of points. Remember, running backs don't necessarily win you leagues. They're solid pieces of the puzzle. So, defining the running back position is ultimately up to you. I'm just giving you 2 different routes that are very popular. But at the end of the day, you don't necessarily have to sweat the position as much as you think. Now let's go more position by position. We kind of looked a little bit at the running backs. We'll talk about them a little bit later. But let's switch to QBs. Because QBs seem to be more set in stone than people think. With the running back market, you're kind of taking flyers, and you might be more interested in streaming a running back than a QB. QBs are definitely tiered. There's levels to them. You have your elite guys who probably will get overdrafted at the end of the day. We'll talk about that a little bit in other shows later in this week and next. Like Mahomes, Allen, Hurts, guys of that nature. Then you have your mid-level guys like Tua, Trevor, those guys who are in prove-it years. And then you have your streaming options like your Goffs and Staffords, guys who aren't necessarily viewed as starters but could potentially break out for you. So, with QBs, it's very interesting because there are at least, say, 8 to 12 guys who I would say would be confident, a lot of people would be confident in taking in this kind of fantasy setting. I would say anyone from that elite to mid-level tier, and we cut it off at around, say, Trevor Lawrence, you would be comfortable with starting. Also, in terms of streaming a quarterback, it's not necessarily something that you should adhere to, but it's a nice little strategy. It was the reason last year that I really was desperate. To start off the year, I unfortunately had auto draft on, so Deshaun Watson of all people was my quarterback. So I found myself having to stream, and that's where I fell into guys like Jared Goff and CJ Stroud, who are more consistent at the QB position, was able to kind of keep me afloat in my fantasy football season. And so, the QB position, while set in stone, you can definitely play around with a lot. You don't have to be locked into a certain philosophy. You don't have to be locked into saying, oh, Chris said 8 to 12 guys I'm going to take. I'm going to key on one of those guys. I'm going to queue him up, and I'm going to draft him. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that you can expand your horizons a little bit. There are definitely streaming options out there who I'm comfortable with saying they can start at least 5 to 10 games in your fantasy football season. I'm not saying that that's a given, considering that there are a ton of QBs to kind of sift through in terms of deciphering whether or not they really are going to perform for you in fantasy. But there's definitely a ton more opportunities for you at the QB position than, say, the running back. And then the wide receiver position. The wide receiver position is definitely topsy-turvy. It's definitely a lot of superstardom at the top. And then you're throwing darts to pick and choose at the end. Let's talk about the superstars. Because like I said when I talked about a guy like Randy Moss, these superstars aren't necessarily guys who in 25 to 50 years are going to be necessarily revolutionized and viewed as a figurehead of the movement as Randy Moss, because I think what brings them down is the lower end guys who aren't necessarily people you would take right away in your fantasy teams. Then you have these kind of topsy-turvy choices as well in terms of new blood coming into the league. How do you weigh the options then? And I think it's a very curious choice to make, because when I look at guys like CeeDee Lamb and Justin Jefferson, they're in wide receiver rooms where they're viewed very highly. They're unlike any other wide receivers that I know. When you look at rookies, they're also going to be viewed very highly because they're on teams that desperately need production out of someone. So, you see what I'm saying in terms of how the wide receiver market has drastically transformed from a guy like Randy Moss, who always performed, to now rookies who have similar opportunities to stars who aren't necessarily in the best wide receiver room situations. Because Lamb and Jefferson are going to get a ton of targets because they know the wide receiver ones, and there's not many others behind him who can really take some of the load off their backs. Similar with Garrett Wilson. Maybe Mike Williams is going to be a stud. Similar with Devontae Adams. A lot of frustration and tension in that situation. Same with Chris Olave. There are a ton of names out there, and there are only a select few where you might not take them because of how deep their receiving room is. Like, take a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, for example. He's one of the best receivers in the league, but because of the fact that Sam Laporta is there as well, you might not take him because you're considering target share. The wide receiver position has changed so drastically from Randy Moss to now that I can't really define it. But ultimately, when I think about these draft strategies, just find a path that works for you and how you want to play the game. Because ultimately, there are just so many drastically different takes on how to define fantasy. But I'm just offering you mine. Coming next, we evaluate a very weird situation in terms of QB room in the league. Russell Wilson and Justin Fields in Pittsburgh. You definitely won't want to miss this segment coming up on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys are enjoying the show thus far. And now, the middle segment of today's show is going to be a weird one, because this is the first time where I've really delved deep into a QB situation in terms of fantasy. We've never really had a QB situation quite like the one we were having in Pittsburgh. You have a guy in Russell Wilson who is losing kind of his credibility as the years go by in terms of how he's viewed in the world of football, and a guy in Justin Fields who it kind of feels like never really got the opportunity to show himself in a positive light because of all the tension that was created when he was a Chicago Bear. Bring these guys together and it really makes for one of the more weird, controversial QB rooms in the league. So I just wanted to try and present to you guys a breakdown of what makes this QB room so difficult to pin down and how it translates to what fantasy is going to say about these two. So let's talk about how the whole situation is panning out right now, because we're hearing a lot of different details coming out of training camp for the Steelers, and we're hearing a lot about how this QB situation might not be shaking out as many people expected. Obviously, as soon as it was set in stone that both of these guys were going to be in this QB room, everyone thought that Russell Wilson, due to his much more experienced nous in the National Football League, would win this position single-handedly. And handily, for that matter. He's a 9-time Pro Bowler. He's a Super Bowl winner. He is top 10 in fantasy in his first 9 seasons. And no QB in 2017 had more fantasy points than him. So, he definitely has the appealing CV. But that's not the issue here. The issue is more off the field than on. Because Russell Wilson, somewhere in Seattle, started becoming more of a businessman than, say, a football player who teams would be passionate about playing with. And somewhere along the line in Pittsburgh, decisions are going to have to be made about whether or not that's a healthy thing for a team that's really trying to solidify the QB position. To have two guys who have such potential really is special for Pittsburgh because they're really trying to find something, because good God, Kenny Pickett was awful for them. I'm sorry to Kenny Pickett, no offense to him, and he's trying to find his way in this league, but he did not cut it for them. And so now, looking at this situation, Wilson certainly offers something, but he has to offer something back. He can't now be a businessman. He has to be someone who is comfortable with a team, and they have to reciprocate that feeling with him. And to earn their trust, he has to, if he wins the position, immediately cement himself as someone who wants to get this Pittsburgh Steelers team going. Now, Fields, on the other hand, might not have as much experience, might have been looked down on for not necessarily getting going in Chicago, but I don't necessarily think it's through any fault of his own. He's someone who has so many traits that Chicago could have brought out earlier. Yes, he was injured, but they didn't necessarily predicate their offense around him. They didn't necessarily make it as field-centric as it could have been, because Fields, he's a fantastic rusher. He hasn't had a 3,000-yard season passing or a 20-touchdown season passing. He has had no playoffs or Pro Bowls, but in terms of upside, I would say Fields is doing well. And that's what is coming out of their training camp right now. Russell Wilson right now actually has a calf injury, and Fields has been getting a lot of first-team reps. And so, when we talk about this QB situation, the tale of the tape says Wilson, but the tale of the future says Fields. And to complicate it even further, to muddy it up even further, both of these guys are on one-year deals, which is very telling about how the Pittsburgh Steelers want to test the waters with this position. Both of these players have to tread very carefully in how and if this position shakes out the way people expect, or if it's unexpected. Because if Wilson gets the job, I guarantee you Justin Fields won't be happy, but he won't be sulking either, because he feels like this is a new opportunity for him. But what if Justin Fields outright wins the position over Russell Wilson? What will that do for Russell Wilson's career, his fantasy stock, and how his reputation gets muddied even further? Because if it weren't for his reputation, and if it weren't for his own decision-making, he could still be in Seattle. I truly believe that Russell Wilson, if he didn't have this attitude shift, could still be a Seattle Seahawk. Now, in terms of fantasy, if I were to kind of sit both Wilson and Fields down and be forced to choose one of them for my fantasy team, to be completely honest with you, I wouldn't want to pick. And that seems very weird, because I say that Fields has more potential. I say that Fields' his rushing ability is some of the best for a quarterback in fantasy we've seen in quite some time. But at the end of the day, Russell Wilson definitely has a trait that not many people have. He's a fantastic deep ball. When I look at the offense in Pittsburgh, I feel like it's more predicated to Wilson's traits than Fields. George Pickens is a deep ball threat. Pat Freiermuth can create yards after the catch. There are a lot of players on this offense that kind of fit Wilson's mold more. And so, being forced to pick, if you took real life out of the question and was just set it up in terms of fantasy, it's very difficult, because Fields, yes, He's a rushing quarterback who has a lot of value there. But at the end of the day, if Fields can't necessarily get the ball down the field as much, how much of his rushing will outweigh his deficiencies passing? Whereas Russell Wilson, a lot of people knew him for his running in Seattle. A lot of people loved his style of running in Seattle. He ran because he had no other option, and he really opened up that Seattle offense because a lot of people had to account for him. Now it's kind of taken away from him. And now I feel like he wants to lean more into the deep ball that makes him so threatening. We saw a little bit of it in Denver, where that deep ball opened up for him and he really found that connection. We saw it last year with him and Sutton. Should he win this QB battle outright? I really think that Russell Wilson is a quarterback who I wouldn't necessarily say should be drafted. He could be drafted, but he's a fascinating streaming option. Think about it. The Steelers are playing in a tough division, the AFC North, where wins will be hard to come by. Do you want a quarterback who has a fantastic amount of potential in one trait, has shown it, but is still very drastically raw in an area that you really want to improve upon? Or do you want a guy who has a couple off-field issues, has a couple of things that make you pause and give you pause about what he offers to a team, but at the end of the day makes more sense for what you want to do offensively? It makes more sense in fantasy when you talk about fantasy value and passing the ball. Because Fields' rushing is great. I want to see it utilized in this system for Pittsburgh. Because if Justin Fields is utilized in many different ways, I really feel like he could be a useful asset to this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. But you can't get past the fact that Russell Wilson, at this point in his career, has something you can't deny. And that is the ability to open up the passing attack and make George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth happy. If it were up to me in this QB battle, I would platoon them for some games. I would see which one fits for the opponent and how they match up and platoon them. I wouldn't pick, because Field is just too valuable to be sitting on the bench all the time. And Russell Wilson certainly is a very schematic kind of quarterback now. He's certainly someone who fits a certain scheme at certain times. But in terms of fantasy, even if it's just for one short year, I would still take Russell Wilson over Justin Fields for just this one time. And that's just because, A, he will be viewed more as a starter, and I think he'll ultimately win this job. And B, I think there's just something about Russell Wilson that screams Steelers. I think this is a perfect team fit for Russell Wilson, because the way that the Steelers are managed really fits with Russell Wilson's identity. But don't ignore Fields either in terms of fantasy, because there's going to be a game where Fields is going to be relied upon, and you don't want to miss out on that. And so when I think about this QB room, it's definitely going to be difficult to parse when it comes fantasy football time, and you're a bit desperate and you want to pick up a quarterback you think will be competent enough to get a win. So tread carefully with this QB room, but it's a fun one to consider. That will just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we switch over to our IDP player profiles and an exciting secondary player who is in one of the best in the league, really looking to have another breakout season. We'll be right back to talk about him after the break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the home stretch of today's show. And we are switching over to the IDP side of things, switching over from this very weird, controversial QB room to some fascinating defensive players. And this guy is one of the best in the league. Kind of came onto the scene a little bit unannounced, so to speak. He really ascended to become one of the better corners in football and one of the most important corners in all of football. So without further ado, let's do our fantasy deep dive into Martin Emerson Jr. The Browns secondary has quickly become one of the most fearsome in all the league. Whether it be the experience and savvy of Denzel Ward and Juan Thornhill, or the youth that Martin Emerson Jr., who I'm talking about right now, and Grant Delpit present, this team is definitely one to look out for. And this unit is definitely one that's going to be consistent in its prowess and consistent in how it is viewed in this league. Without further ado, let's talk about the player that should be talked about more in this unit, in Martin Emerson Jr. He had 179 fantasy points last year. He had a 45.5% ball hawk rate in terms of following other receivers. That's really impressive. Quickly ascending the ranks of ESPN's top 10 corners at the position. He had 45 solo tackles, not a 45. That would be very impressive. 1 tackle for loss, 14 pass breakups, 4 interceptions. So, as you can see, Martin Emerson Jr. just about covers all the bases you expect out of a player in the secondary in a 4-3 unit that really speaks to getting takeaways as much as possible. Because when I think about the Browns secondary, especially last year, and the Browns defense as a whole for that matter, they were highly predicated on winning the turnover battle. Maybe this year will be different, because who knows what Deshaun Watson's going to bring at the QB position, but last year, the QB situation was very murky at best. Only when Joe Flacco came did the defense not really have to matter as much. But when the defense does matter, it really shows that it can step up. And what I love about the Browns defense in particular is the way Jim Schwartz employs each and every single one of his players. We talked a little bit about that defensive front. We talked a little bit about their linebackers. But when talking about the secondary, that's where it gets so interesting. Because the Browns secondary is so predicated on being so solid in coverage that people forget how good they are at switching in and out of them. It's very rare because Jim Schwartz feels comfortable allowing these corners and safeties to stay on islands. But when the Browns do employ these corners and safeties in different ways, when they're scheming up blitzes, that's where the Browns secondary really impresses. That's where Martin Emerson comes into play. Because Martin Emerson is the true wild card of this Browns defense, and people might not know that. So let's talk about how the secondary is set up. Martin Emerson Jr. is on the right side, plays the right cornerback position. So he's either covering the right slot and the right outside receiver. Denzel Ward's on the left. Delpit and Thornhill are your safeties. Grant Delpit strong, Thornhill free. when I think about this defense, and I think about the ways it can rotate in and out of different schemes, I think it's perfect for Martin Emerson Jr. to have another year that was just as big as last year for him. Because Denzel Ward, we talked about him a little bit on the show, number 2 overall cornerback in ESPN's brains, and perhaps the number 2 cornerback in your minds as well, really plays a very strong coverage game. He really plays the game of football almost as if he's covering every blade of grass. He's in every blade of grass corner. That being said, Denzel Ward is also a very solid tackler. So, when I think about when the Browns bring the house, I think of Denzel Ward as the kind of guy who's going to be in and around the play on, say, later downs. Now, how does this affect Martin Emerson Jr.? Martin Emerson Jr. isn't necessarily as savvy as Denzel Ward, I will admit, but what really makes him pop and stand out is that him and Ward are inextricably linked in how they play the game. They know exactly when the other wants to pounce. They know exactly what makes the traits in the other really stand out and make it really difficult to defend. Because when Denzel Ward on later downs is further up and is making tackles in and around the ball, that's when Martin Emerson Jr. can really come to pounce. Because say it's a 3rd and 5 or 7, and the Browns defense and want Denzel Ward closer to the play, Martin Emerson Jr. can really create havoc in the back by being the coverage man. I really think that Martin Emerson Jr. is so versatile in either man or zone that should a team pass against him, he will be there to either break up the pass or intercept the football. Now let's talk about how the safeties come into this, because the safeties are very interesting. Juan Thornhill is your typical free safety. He's a guy who might blitz occasionally, but at the end of the day is your prototypical free safety, the last line of defense, the guy who's going to make sure no receiver gets past him. And it's kind of similar for Grant Delpit, but Grant Delpit, remember this, he's kind of the baby of the secondary, so to speak. He's kind of the young guy who hasn't really been in the league. He has been in the league actually for longer than people think, but the reason I'm calling him the baby of the secondary is that he's not had as much playing time as some of this group. Now, I don't necessarily think there's a hindrance to him because I still think he's a solid cover safety. But I really think Grant Delpit, should he be someone who blitzes a lot and comes up in coverage, really allows Martin Emerson Jr. the ability to really stand out in this system. And so, thinking about the Browns' safety depth and how it impacts Martin Emerson Jr., I really like Martin Emerson Jr. on an island by himself. I think it's weird to say that you would want a corner on an island and have him in such an isolated situation, but Martin Emerson is just that good at understanding that he is now becoming more of a cover man, whereas Ward will have more opportunities to be an on-ball kind of guy in later downs. Now let's talk about how this all relates to the front, because the front is getting a lot of attention. Deservedly so. The front is perhaps the most fearsome in the league as well. And so, all of this will be rendered a moot point if the front really does its job and does it well. And when you think about the Browns front, you'd find no concerns with it because Myles Garrett's so good. He finally has some running partners in Zadarius Smith, Dalvin Tomlinson. And I really think that the Browns front sets the tone more than the Browns secondary. That being said, if Martin Emerson Jr. makes the decision to be more of a coverage guy, it really kind of limits the space an offense has to operate. Especially in the AFC North. We talk a lot about the AFC North in this show. We talk a lot about the different offenses in it. The Ravens, RPO heavy. Maybe less so with Derrick Henry this year, but I still think they're RPO heavy. The Bengals, short passing game. Really get Jamar Chase and T. Higgins in space and let them work. The Steelers, we don't really know. They're kind of a wild card like we saw. But they might be a similar story, they might be a different story. Either way, still RPO heavy if it's Fields, and I believe that. And if it's Wilson, a lot of deep passing. So, you're going to want a secondary player to really step up in the play and be the guy that sets the tone. And that's Denzel Ward. And then you're going to need a guy who is in the back end all the time and locking down players, and that's Emerson. And last year, he really proved that he's ready to make that transition. He's ready to really focus on allowing Denzel Ward space to create outside of the system and the scheme. And he's stepping into an own role where he's comfortable being someone who is trusted in coverage and, most importantly, really helping these safeties. And so that's what makes not just the Browns secondary, but Martin Emerson such a wild card. If he wasn't such a good coverage man, I feel like a lot more teams would be comfortable running the ball or passing the ball on later downs, rather. And so, Martin Emerson Jr. isn't necessarily a good player within a good system because of his own versatility, if you see what I'm saying. It's because of the team's versatility and his reactionary response to it that he's really growing into the player we know he can be. And that's what's exciting about what he brings to the table as an IDP prospect, because he's going to get a lot of stats that you might value in that department. But that should just about do it. Listen, coming up to finish up the show, we finish with another young secondary player, and a secondary that's really growing into its own, much like the Cleveland Browns, and really kind of molded in the Cleveland Browns image. We'll be right back to discuss that on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are sticking in the realm of IDP player profiles, and we are sticking in the secondary with another guy kind of in the mold of what the Cleveland Browns are doing, kind of the center of attention in the secondary. For the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, yes, we are talking about the great Antoine Winfield Jr., kind of more of the safety position, kind of more of a freer player in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers system, but a guy who I really believe is slowly going to become someone not just coveted in IDP, but more appreciated in the league as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense becomes ever more better. And so without further ado, let's jump right into what makes him so special. 512.5 fantasy points throughout his entire career, 182.5 last year. Incredible feat for a safety. 76 solo tackles last year, 6 tackles for loss, 6 sacks, 12 passes defended, 3 interceptions, 6 forced fumbles. You're thinking this guy might be Jamal Adams, but there's a reason why he's not. And I'll tell you why. When Antoine Winfield Jr. kind of came into his own in the Buccaneers system, it was when, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers really were building something in the Tom Brady year. That's when Antoine Winfield Jr. really came into his own. And now I feel like Antoine Winfield Jr. is not necessarily anomalous. The Buccaneers secondary is perhaps the best part of their defense. I really believe so. But the reason why Antoine Winfield Jr. might be quote-unquote losing luster is because the momentum of the Buccaneers has not necessarily gone up after the Brady year. It's kind of similar. Last year, though, Baker Mayfield proved that he was a serviceable and decent quarterback for their offense, and they made the playoffs and won a game. But I just kind of feel like there needs to be equal spirit and leadership on both sides of the ball. And they had it with Tom Brady, and that's where Antoine Winfield really was able to see what it means to be a leader in a system, and that's what really made him stand out. Now that, he really is one of the leaders, if not the leader of this defense, I really believe that it's all going to come down to how not just the other players in the secondary kind of surround him and revolve around him, but also how Antoine Winfield Jr. develops as a player. Because like I said, you would think he's Jamal Adams with the stats he's putting up, at the safety position no less. But there's a reason that he's not. And the reason that he's not is that I don't necessarily think the Bucs want to use him in a way where he's constantly blitzing. Because Antoine Winfield Jr. is still a fantastic coverageman, and he's doing it against high-end opposition. And thinking about the pieces you have in the secondary as well to kind of offset what Antoine Winfield Jr. brings. I think about Jamel Dean. He's a fantastic coverageman. If you saw a receiver, if you saw the impact he had in that Lions game that we were talking about, you saw how fantastic Jamel Dean was at coverage and locking up someone, being isolated on an island and facing some of the better receivers in the league. You understand the depth outside of Antoine Winfield Jr. on this defense. And so I think the Bucs need to understand that Antoine Winfield Jr. doesn't necessarily have to be deployed in a Jamal Adams-esque way. I think that it allows him to be free in the way he plays, to be free in the way he diagnoses and reads plays. But it really kind of diminishes the rest of the Bucs secondary to think that Antoine Winfield Jr. is slowly becoming more of a linebacker than it is a safety. Because at the end of the day, the bottom line is Antoine Winfield can lead with his play, but he can't lead with his style of play. It's tough as a safety to really make your bones in this league as someone who constantly is involved in not just, your role and purpose as a safety, but someone who is always in and around the ball, in and around the play. I think that the reason why Antoine Winfield Jr. might not be highly coveted in IDP is because maybe the Bucs secondary is a little bit underrated. maybe it's because Antoine Winfield Jr. might have a longer injury history than other safeties. Because he's not a typical safety prototype. Because he's not someone who is willing to sit back as much. Because he wants to be in and around the play. Does that necessarily damage what you have going into this? Or do you now see the opportunities arising to really implement Antoine Winfield Jr. in so many different ways? And I think that another part of it is, well, maybe, this Bucs defensive line that's filled with a lot of depth, but perhaps not as much as production you believe, is just stagnant sometimes. Maybe you need an Antoine Winfield Jr. to really boast over all levels of the defense. But you really need to weigh your options here with him. He's not a player who can just run out there every week expecting him to be your everyman. It's not what safeties are supposed to do every single given week. And so, I don't necessarily think the problem with Antoine Winfield Jr. is that he needs someone to keep him in check. I just really think that he needs to understand himself that, hey, I love that I'm viewed now as a leader of this team, as someone who has gained the trust and respect of all of my teammates. But the toll it takes to do this, and the understanding I need to play the safety position, is twofold here. Do I really want to risk kind of tensing up this team if I underperform? And also several facets of what I need to improve as a safety myself to get to the point where I want to be. Because right now, when you look at those stats, there's not much you would want more out of Antoine Winfield Jr. But in order for more, he has to understand that less is more. And so, playing snap after snap with a high motor is fantastic. But when you're a young leader of a defense that wants to take that next step, I really think the troubles you run into are much greater than people think. At the end of the day, Antoine Winfield Jr. will always be viewed as one of the great safeties of this era. When all is said and done, Antoine Winfield Jr., the stats he puts up, will really determine and define IDP leagues as well, and how people view safeties there. But the market doesn't necessarily have to require a guy like Antoine Winfield Jr. to do too much. When you're looking for a solid safety, you should be looking for a guy who, yes, is fantastic in stats, but adds a value that stems far beyond stats. Because there are deeper nuances to the stats that you're reading. And Antoine Winfield Jr. right now is a stats on paper kind of guy. I want him to be a stats, a nuanced guy, if that makes sense to some. But at the end of the day, the bottom line of Antoine Winfield Jr. is you can't ignore what he's doing right now at the safety position. You can't ignore someone like him, because it's exactly what happened when Jamal Adams was doing. It's exactly what you would not expect from a safety, and that was what makes it so powerful in how he's doing it. But But like I said, there's balance to everything. Power does not necessarily mean nuance and fluidity. And so, I want to see Antoine Winfield Jr. grow in certain areas before I really would say I would pick him for IDP for option other than just stats. That'll just about do it for today's show. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please like, follow, and subscribe to this show. It is a huge support to everyone involved. Consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. Other than that, I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again. We'll be back better than ever tomorrow to end off the week just right.